As most of you know, Throne and Liberty released last year in Korea with a pretty overwhelmingly negative response. Most reviewers were trashing it as a mobile game that was trying to disguise itself to PC players, and in response, NCSoft started to make some changes such as removing auto combat or adding some movement to your basic attacks. But even as recently as July, the North American beta that we all got to play still felt pretty stale, uninteresting, and unfinished. So if you had asked me even 2 months ago if this game had a shot in the West, I would say no, dead on arrival. However, right after that mediocre NA beta test ended, Throne released an update in Korea that so completely overhauled the game, they have gotten me to completely change my mind. I ended up playing the Korean version for a month straight, and my verdict now is that I am seriously excited for the NA launch of this game. So let's talk about why this game is suddenly so good, but also things that they're still doing wrong, and make some overall predictions about how Throne is going to do in the West. So here's a clip from the combat from the North American beta a couple months ago. And as you can see, I mean, the abilities have a bit of a punch to them, so, they kind of feel good to use. But overall, I'm kind of just using my abilities in a predictable order here. There's not a lot of interesting interactions between the skills or interesting combos or anything like that. I kind of just use the skills as they come up in a particular order. And there's not a whole lot of thought or strategy or interesting dynamics at play here. Now, if we fast forward to the Korean version, we have a new system called skill specialization, which completely overhauls every single skill in the game. So we now have 3 to 5 adjustments that we can make to every ability that we use. And so I'm going to start off here by just kind of showing you guys the old basic fireball before the specialization. Pretty standard. Cast time. If I move, it gets canceled. So I have to stay put. I have to wait for the spell to go off. It can proc an extra fireball, and so if I cast that, I'd have to stay there and stand still again to get a second one off. But now if we go to skill specialization, with this skill, I can change it to be a chunkier fireball that takes a little bit longer to charge, or I can change it to be an instant fireball and then it won't have a cast time at all. So both of those are already interesting choices, but then in addition to that, I can take this able to move. I like able to move a lot with focus firebombs, because what we're going to be able to do now is charge up an even bigger fireball, which this thing just feels really good to use compared to the old one. But I can also move around a bit while I'm casting it, right? And so that comes in handy, especially like in dungeons when I need to adjust a little bit to get out of a boss mechanic or something. But it also just makes the skill feel a little bit better, a little bit more fluid. And a ton of these skills have really high impactful choices like that. This ice spell, I can make this so that it goes across the ground and can hit multiple targets, or I can make it so that it focuses on a single target and does a bunch more damage. This meteor spell, something similar. I can have one big meteor that's really good for PvP when you're hitting multiple targets, or I can have a bunch of little meteors that it's kind of the opposite. It's really good for like PvE scenarios where I want to hit a boss multiple times with the same ability. And in addition to just the sheer variety that this system adds, so that it makes it so that my mage playstyle is very different from other people's mage playstyles, in addition to just the sheer variety, it also just makes the game feel better. It makes the combat feel a lot more alive, a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more decisions that I'm making. There's a lot more interesting combos that are now available, and it feels a lot better when you perform well in PvE. Now, speaking of PvE, I wanted to talk about this before we get into PvP, because the game has mostly been depicted as a PvP game, and that's what I was going into it expecting. So when I ran dungeons in this game, I wasn't doing it expecting to enjoy the dungeons. I was doing it so that I could get better gear, so that I could be stronger in PvP. And the Tier 1 dungeons, the original dungeons that kind of came with the initial launch of the game, are pretty boring. But the recent dungeons that they added, the Tier 2 dungeons, are some of the most fun content that I've ever done in an MMO. Like, they're accessible enough that you can figure out the mechanics without having to watch a guide, but they're challenging enough so that, even if you do watch a guide, and even if you do figure the dungeon out, they still keep you on your toes. You can gradually progress as your gear gets better, and some of the mechanics you'll be able to skip, or, you'll be able to kind of ignore them, but some of the mechanics you can't. Some of them you're still going to have to do, and so you simultaneously feel yourself progressing through these dungeons, but they also keep you on your toes, which keeps it from just being this kind of like stale clockwork thing that you're just knocking out repetitively. And then on top of that, they also added a challenge dungeon system, so that when you're done with your regular dungeon runs, you can do kind of like a Mythic Plus version of the dungeons where they get harder and harder. And this isn't just HP and damage scaling, this is new mechanics as well. And same thing, as we progressed through these, all the new mechanics that they added, I was pretty impressed with just about every single one of them. I mean, the tier 2 dungeons in this game are genuinely some of the most fun I've ever had PvEing in any game. And that was me going into it again with no expectations at all. I was just like, let's grind and get these done so we can get back to the good stuff, right? But I actually ended up really enjoying the PvE and really enjoying doing these challenge runs, and it became like a staple part of the content that me and my core group of friends were enjoying playing together. As far as like the grinding portion of the game, there is both good and bad. The main, most rewarding grinding that you're going to do is called Abyssal Dungeons. And so those are open world dungeons that are non instanced, where everyone can go in at the same time. At nighttime, these dungeons become PvP, and that can be very fun. However, during daytime, which is like 75% of the time or more, there is no PvP, and so because of the lack of density in these dungeons, I found that oftentimes there were too many people there, and we were all kind of just like griefing each other trying to get tags. It wasn't that enjoyable of an experience. So I'm really hoping that they add some more density here, or add more of these dungeons in general. I know that even in the latest level 55 update, they've added some more of these dungeons, but my concern is that people are just going to move from the 50 dungeons to the 55 dungeons, so it's not really more content, it's just different content, and that means it's going to have the same density problem. But I haven't seen these new dungeons, so maybe they do have more density there. I'm hopeful that that's a problem that gets solved. But right now, it really just feels like you're kind of griefing each other. It even feels like you're throwing a bit if you go down there with a group, because if you go into a dungeon and there's already people there, usually you can just join their group. And then that'll be a lot more smooth than if you bring 5 of your own friends, and now you're making it even more crowded and you're bringing even more people that are competing for tags. So I don't like how it sort of punishes you for bringing your own friends. Now, some of the other PvE content, there's something called Tatel's Tower, where you can climb right now 20 floors of dungeons. This was super fun, but they're only one-time dungeons, and it's very easy to kind of like blow past some of these without realizing it. So if you're playing really actively and you're gearing and you forget about these dungeons for a bit and then you come and do them, a lot of them are just very easy and they don't end up challenging you. But I do think there's a ton of potential here. If they add challenge modes for these, the way that they've added challenge mode for the tier 2 dungeons, I think that a lot of these fights could be a lot of fun. Like a few of these are very memorable and very enjoyable if the difficulty is kind of right and you're not, over gearing it too much. So I think there is a ton of potential here, although right now they're kind of just one and done, and so there's not a lot of content. But I do think that there will be more of these in the future, or at least I'm hopeful that there will be. And then finally, there is something called contracts, which I think needs to basically just be completely reworked. They're sort of like dailies. Technically, you don't have to do them every day. You can bank them up for like 5 or 6 days and then do them all at once on the weekend. But they're basically just like little chores where you have to go and do mundane tasks out in the world, like interact with this item, or kill these mobs that you wouldn't really otherwise be interested in killing. I find those to be kind of boring and repetitive daily chores that, daily chores are never good in an MMO, in my opinion. And so I think that that needs to get just totally reworked at some point. And then lastly, there are PvE events and world bosses that happen on a set schedule. So you can open up your map and find this schedule here. Honestly, I haven't been super impressed with either one of these from a PvE standpoint. We'll get into the PvP versions in just a second, but the events that you do they're basically mob tagging contests to see like who can get the most of whatever tokens. Some of them have a little bit of variety to them, but for the most part, it's kind of the same copy and paste formula. And if you're playing a melee build, good luck. And then the field bosses, I think they're just kind of too easy. And this might be a result of playing the boosted server and having everyone gear up faster than normal. But even before everyone got gear, and like even on the NA beta, I feel like the PvE bosses are kind of just a little bit undertuned, and you kind of just show up with a bunch of people and you zerg them and face roll them, and there's not a lot of mechanics to deal with. And they're kind of just big loot pinatas, which fair enough, but I think there's a lot more that they could do with both the events and the field bosses. PvP has been a major focus in Throne from the very start. So there are a ton of different PvP modes in this game. Everything from small scale dungeon, open world dungeon fights to a 3v3 arena. There are 70 versus 70 instanced guild wars. Then there are open worlds guild wars where as many different guilds can show up as you want. Guilds can ally other guilds to create zergs of up to 280 people. And then there will be PvP world bosses where all these different zergs will come together and it's this huge brawl. Sometimes there's over 1,000 people showing up to the higher end field bosses. And when this happens, the performance in the game is really, really good. I had a little bit of lag, as you can kind of see here from the siege footage, when there was, literally 1,000 people nearby. But I think a lot of that honestly was just because I was playing on high ping on a Korean server. The game itself, in terms of FPS and performance, works pretty well, even with an absolute ton of people around. And so you've also got sieges that happen once a month. You've got a tax card event that happens right before the siege, where this is another open world event where the castle defenders try to protect the cart as it moves across the map. The rest of the server shows up and gangs up on the cart, gangs up on the players, and tries to pillage the loot. There are guilds and Dominion events that happen periodically. So it's like the regular events, except if it's a guild event, you are obviously teaming up with your guild. If it's a Dominion event, then you just get placed on a random green, blue, or red team, and then you fight against other players from the other teams. So there's kind of the guild version, and there's kind of just the random pickup version of that. My main problem with all of these things is that they just don't happen very often. So if we look at the schedule here, we can see some Dominion events happening or some Guild PvP events. They happen at the same time. So these happen every 3 hours. And then when it comes to field bosses, these also happen every 3 hours. But these events are only 30 minutes long. So at best, you have, 30 or 60 minutes of PvP out of every 3 hour chunk that's occurring. And it's the same thing with open world PvP. The dungeons that you're going to be fighting people in, the abyssal dungeons, those are daytime for 2 hours and then they're nighttime for 30 minutes. And often that 30-minute nighttime will happen at the same time as one of these events. So you're probably going to go to the event. You're probably not going to do the dungeon PvP. Because those things are going to overlap. And so your actual opportunities to PvP in the game are limited to 1/3 or less of the time that you're online. The only exception to that is the 3v3 arena, which is fun, but I mean, I don't want to do it for 2 hours straight while I'm waiting for the big guild wars and the events and the field bosses and everything else, right? And so I don't know. I feel like there needs to be, at the very minimum, probably some open world dungeons that are PvP 24/7 rather than just PvP for 30 minutes at night and then safe for the other 2 hours. On top of that, they have floated the idea of traditional battlegrounds where, like a Warsong Gulch or an Arathi Basin type of thing where you can queue up and be put on a team and fight against another team. I think that would be really good as well. The 3v3 arena is fun, so I'm sure like a 12 versus 12 battleground would be very fun as well. I don't know if that's confirmed though, or if that's just something that's floating around, so we'll see if anything comes from that. One other PvP feature that I think they've done very well is auto translate. I don't know if this was intended as a PvP feature, but I'll throw some of the chat up on the screen from after the tax cart event in Korea. And as you can see, Russians, Koreans, Chinese people, like all these different languages coming together to call each other names. It really is a beautiful thing. All right, now let's get to what I think is by far the game's biggest flaw, which is the early game and the questing slash leveling. If there is one part of this game that is going to severely hinder its success and cause a lot of people to bounce off of it, it is this leveling process. There's really no way to sugarcoat it. It is one of the most boring leveling processes that I've ever gone through. The story is kind of just a walking simulator, typical soulless, like phoned in leveling experience that we've come to expect from MMOs nowadays for whatever reason. It feels like we're in this death spiral right now where players complain about the leveling process being boring, and so developers try to condense it more and more. But then that just makes it even more boring because you don't have a chance to get invested in the characters. You don't have a chance to get invested in any of the zones. You're blasting through from one zone to the next. It's half the quests are just walking from one destination to the next because you're going through everything so quickly and you're going to new areas so often. And I don't something has just gone severely wrong with the entire leveling and story quest process in MMOs. I honestly think that we should just stop doing main story quests in MMOs, or if you're going to have one, you have to find a way to integrate that story into the same gameplay loops that the player is going to be experiencing in endgame. Like there shouldn't be game A that happens for the first X amount of hours and then game B that happens once you're max level. It should all be the same game and it should be fun and addictive at level one. This game will not addict you at level one. Level one will be a boring slog that you have to get through in order to get to the good part. And it's a meme at this point to say like it gets good after X number of hours, but that is the case here. The first 5 to 10 hours of the game are just not going to be fun, and if you want to experience Throne, you're going to have to slog through those until you get to the good part. Some people have said that they like the story and they like the cutscenes. And I mean, I will say the production value is very solid. Like the cutscenes are cool visually, everything is good, but the story itself is really forgettable. You just don't really get so sucked into the characters. All the good guys are like, we must save the children, and all the bad guys are like, how dare you interrupt my evil plans, and then they like laugh maniacally, and I don't know, it's all just kind of like very Disney and plain. And so I don't think that most people will experience the story in a positive light, but a few of you I'm sure will enjoy the 5 or 10 hours of leveling, and you'll take your time and you'll actually read the lore, and that's great for you. But 95% of people I think are just gonna be bored out of their mind. The puzzles in this game are like beyond game journalist difficulty. They're like, I don't even know what to call it. It's like 6-year-old difficulty. Like they're unfailably dumb. And I'll throw some of them up on the screen here. Like this could be interesting. These puzzles where you have to kind of like look at the item and find little clues. Like this could be a cool little mini game, but instead it's like it's just so blatantly obvious what you're supposed to do. I mean, you don't even have to read the objective. You can just mouse your cursor over the thing, and when your cursor changes, that's where you're supposed to click. Like you don't have to put your any thought into it whatsoever. Here's another section where like I have different dialogue choices that I'm supposed to make, but they're just all the same choice. Like so, I don't know. There's one quest where it's like you have to pick the right plants, and the quest objective is like pick up the mandrake root, and the other plants are not mandrake roots. They're like slimy mushroom or something, and so it's like, oh man, which one do I pick? I don't know. Like there could be the questing could involve like actual puzzles. It could involve like actual scavenger hunts, or something like that. But they just don't. They're just like so stale and dumb and easy. And like when you already know what's happening, or like you already know where to click, you're not even really playing a game at that point. You're kind of just going through the motions. And it's hard for me to it's really hard for me to understand how we've gotten to this point. Um, I think it's going to be kind of like a Final Fantasy 14 situation eventually, where the community is just going to have to explain to people that like if you can slog through the first part, it gets better. And luckily, the slog in this game is a lot shorter than it is in Final Fantasy 14. Some other problems with the new player experience, there are way too many menus. Like when you first get into the game, there's not quite as many of these in the NA launch as there are in Korea. I think they've trimmed it a little bit, but it's still like way too many. You've got the battle pass and all this other stuff, which is just stupid, and it all lights up in red, and oh, my dopamine, there's a red button to click, and like the stuff that we've all come to hate and yet is still being shoved down our throats, unfortunately exists in this game as well, although I will say it could be a lot worse. Um, and then the last thing that I think is really going to cause people to bounce off the game is that there's just so many noob traps in the beginning. Like there's so many stats that you have to understand, and if you don't understand them, it's really easy to make mistakes, and then it's really difficult to recover from those mistakes. So like if I level up the wrong gear, It's not easy to like go out and get different gear. I mean, the levels of the gear transfer over, but the traits and other forms of progress that you're aiming for don't. Like it's there's not an easy way to correct those. So there are a lot of ways to mess up as a new player, which pretty much forces you to have to follow a guide, which I just think is boring. Like the stats and the builds in the game should be intuitive enough to where you can find a build that works for you without being forced to go and research or follow a guide that someone who's already played for 200 hours has put together for you. I just think a lot of it is too convoluted and not going to feel accessible or immersive to a new player. There's some other things that I have to bring up that I don't. Maybe this is just a pet peeve of mine, but like I don't know why in these Korean games every female character has heals in like every scenario. Like I'm like walking through this ancient ruined dungeon in high heel. I don't know. Is that just me? I just think it's so dumb. But other parts of the game, the immersion is actually extremely good. There's a giant whale that you can ride. Sorry if that is kind of a spoiler, but like this is a taxi that takes you to a part of the game where you can unlock a waypoint that you can only get if you ride this whale. And I don't know. I just think that like the experience of doing this for the first time and uncovering the island that it takes you to is super fun. When you get down into some of the deeper dungeons for the first time, those environments are really immersive. There are a lot of just cool features of the game. Like there's a dungeon that only opens when it rains. And then there is an ability that's you can get if you're I think if you're the player with the most activity or something like that, where you can make it rain like on a set cooldown, so you can force that dungeon to open and you can be like that guy who's in control of it. And if you don't do it, then people just have to wait for it to rain naturally. um, there's a dungeon that closes at nighttime, and so if since the dungeon is PvP at nighttime, once you are in there after it closes, if you die, you cannot get back in until daytime, and so that kind of like drives the stakes for PvP in that dungeon way up. The other dungeons don't have that feature, so if you die, you can come back in, so that's a little bit more forgiving. But then there's the one dungeon where you get locked out. Um, there are also a lot of cool jump puzzles and environmental puzzles. This is a part of the game that feels like it has a decent start, but like way more potential that it could reach. There's some side quests and stuff where some of the like scavenger hunts and jump puzzles are pretty interesting. There's a system called Mystic Keys where you spend your contract coins to get these keys, and then they give you really good rewards. And the way you spend the keys is by finding these hidden like nodes throughout the game, and a lot of them will be like on top of a really tall building. You have to figure out how to get up there, or you have to like find another high point and fly there. You might have to manage your stamina when you're flying, so you have to like do a vertical jump at just the right time, or you have to sprint at just the right time. And a lot of these are like were genuinely fun to figure out, but some of them are also just kind of like tedious and feel like unfinished or kind of just like thrown together very quickly. So I think there's a lot more that can be done with the environment and with the grappling hook system and with the flying. But there's a decent start to it as well. So now that we've kind of eviscerated the game and gone through the parts of it that I dislike the most, let's talk about the part of the game that actually gives me the most optimism for the future, which is the rate and quality of the updates, as well as the quality of the communication that we've been getting from the devs. So most MMO communication is like marketing and PR, and it's always very kind of like flat, and they never really say anything that matters. That is not the case with Throne of Liberty. The communication that we've gotten from the devs, if you go and like read the patch notes and you read the descriptions of why there's a change, or if you look at the roadmap, which we'll take a look at in a second, like the comments are clearly very thoughtful. They're clearly coming from people who play MMOs and like MMOs and are listening to player feedback and like actually getting to the point of what is being complained about and actually getting to the bottom of those problems rather than just doing band-aids or whatever or treating the symptoms. Like they're actually getting to the root and understanding why players dislike something, and then coming up with really good solutions to come up with those problems. And then on top of that, they're doing it really quickly. there's a bunch of stuff that I made notes of throughout my time playing in Korea where I was gonna like complain about this feature, that feature, this bug, that bug, whatever. And a ton of those things are just fixed now. They're just fine. So like some examples would be they added a new system called trait resonance, where once you finish upgrading all the traits in your gear, there's this RNG thing where you can roll for another bonus stat, and you would have to roll and roll and roll and roll to get the stat that you wanted, and it was like really tedious. Sometimes you'd have to roll like dozens of times, to get this like 5% chance that you needed, and then you'd have to do that again on the next piece of gear, the next piece of gear, and within like a week or two of the all the negative feedback that they got, they just added a solution to where you could pay an additional cost and force the resonance trait on your piece of gear and then be done. So if you wanted to gamble, you could still gamble and you could still get lucky and save resources. But for people who didn't want to spend all this time and headache and tediousness gambling over and over and over again, you could just force the trait and get a little bit of extra resources together and get that done. So there were a bunch of other things that were similar to that, where it was like tedious or it took too long or there was too much RNG, and then they listened to player feedback, and now those systems all feel like really good and really satisfying to progress through. A lot of little things too, like not being able to vote kick trolls from dungeon runs, if you're pugging a dungeon, or like someone who goes AFK and you couldn't do anything about it, and then people were like, hey, like these dungeons are getting hard now. We need to take them more seriously. We need to be able to kick people who are screwing around. And then a couple weeks later, they added a vote kick system. So they are really good at listening to players and implementing solutions really quickly, like especially within the last couple months. It's been crazy to see what they have been able to do. The roadmap, if we take a look at this, it looks fantastic to me. The pacing here is excellent. There is going to be a ton of stuff happening, while at the same time, it's not such an egregious pace that you have to be like a no life, no job, play all day to keep up. This is a roadmap that's going to be very friendly towards people with jobs, people who are playing kind of casually, people who are free to play, who don't want to spend it all. We'll go into the monetization and the pay to win in a bit, but if you're not a pay to win player, this is a schedule that is going to be very friendly to you. You will be able to compete and keep up even with those whale players because of the content progression here. The major updates they are saying are going to be happening every 3 to 4 months. So, this isn't like every couple of weeks you're going to have to play all day and catch up. Like, you're going to have a solid amount of time to enjoy the content, to get the gear, to catch up to the whales, to be viable in PvP, and, you just to enjoy all that before the next major content patch hits and kind of puts you back on the treadmill. Let's talk about crafting and gathering next. The gathering is pretty bare bones at the moment. There's not a skill associated with this or anything. You kind of just walk up to a tree or a plant or whatever it is. You press the button, you wait a second, and then you get the reward. The only part of this that I find kind of enjoyable is that there are some very rare drops you can get in terms of like different morphs or different amatoys that you can only get from gathering, and you have to get it from like gathering in a certain zone. And I don't know. So I guess there's a bit of a lottery that you can chase with gathering there, but overall this feels pretty underdeveloped to me. I would like to see an actual gathering skill that you could progress, as well as maybe some gathering gear, like a tool or maybe a set of tools. They did recently add a fishing skill, and there are better fishing poles that you can find. So, being able to find like a better axe or a better, like pickaxe or something that allows you to get better resources, I think would be interesting. Although, right now, the materials that you get from gathering are fairly basic, and their uses are fairly basic. So they probably would need to expand the crafting system as well if they were going to do that. Crafting is also something that's kind of bare bones and thrown right now. You don't really craft in the traditional sense. Again, there's no crafting skills. So there's like no way to progress that. What you do is you go talk to an NPC in town and you assemble different items together. But the resources that you're paying for this are more like just a bonus cost. If it's, for example, a piece of gear that you're crafting, there's something called a lithograph that you're going to need to get that piece of gear. And once you have the lithograph, you basically have the piece made. The crafting resources are not really enabling you to do that. They're more like just an extra fee that you have to pay in order to get the item made. Like these are all just generic resources. There's nothing about these that really allows you to suddenly craft, Hell's Gale Blade if that's what you want to make. It's really the lithograph here that is the bottleneck, and the rest of this is kind of just resources that are used for all kinds of things. So the crafting and gathering, I hope in the future it will receive some sort of significant update where crafting is more interesting. Right now, all these items, these aren't like craftable only items. These are just the regular weapons that you would get from dungeons or other parts of the game. But the lithograph is another way that you can obtain that item. So there's nothing really special about crafting right now. I do think that there is enough of an infrastructure here to where crafting and gathering could be added as progressible skills and could be a significant part of the game in the future, but I don't know if there is any kind of roadmap or promise for that to happen. The skills that you can progress right now are fishing, cooking, and expeditions. And all of these things are very new and they still feel very new. Like they all feel like they have only been worked on for a month or two, probably because they did only work on them for a month or two. I don't think these systems are amazing, but again, I do think it's a solid foundation considering these are just things that got added to the game like last month. There's a lot more that they can do. The fishing is, it's simple enough. The mini game is fine. There's a little bit of skill to it, but it's still pretty relaxing. The expeditions, you collect these amatoys throughout the game, and then you can send them out on missions to get you resources. And this is going to be like one of the primary ways that you get materials for cooking, or some of those materials that you need to slam together if you do craft an item in town. And so this system right here feels very unfinished. Some of the numbers don't really make sense. Like there are some of these areas where just strategically they would never be a viable option, and a lot of the rewards that you get are kind of repetitive from zone to zone. I again would expect that in the future this is going to get some kind of overhaul or some sort of extensive fleshing out. But it's kind of all of these life skills I think right now are in a state where it's like, okay, we've got something going. It works well enough. Is it going to be the main thing that like keeps you interested in the game? No. But it's nice little bonus. It's a nice little thing to do to break up the PvP or break up your dungeon runs or whatever. I don't think that the fishing or the cooking or the expeditions are going to be something that like really hooks a lot of people, but they serve as a nice bonus, and I do think that they have a lot of potential to expand in the future. Okay, now we come to everyone's favorite part of the discussion, monetization. This is the cash shop in all its glory, and look at all the costumes and the pretty birdies and the stuffed animals and the sewing thread. So many things you can buy here. You can actually buy this with gold. That's not even real money. Look at them. But yeah, this is mostly cosmetics. Honestly, a lot of the stuff that you see in here isn't actually going to affect gameplay. Some of these things like the morphs and the pets will give you a very, very tiny bonus to those dimensions of the game, but you can also get those bonuses just through regular gameplay and through unlocking the pets and the morphs that you get as a free-to-play player. So nothing here is mandatory. There is a battle pass, and I think most people are probably going to want to buy this. I'm guessing it's going to be, like $15 or something in NA. And it's just this whole bottom row here is all going to be resources you can get. Is this make or break? Is this like such a huge amount of resources that you have to buy the battle pass? No. And, as a free-to-play player, if you don't buy this, you certainly can just play a little bit extra and catch up. This isn't like a mountain of extra resources or anything. But the most egregious part of the monetization, which squarely lands this game in the pay-to-win category, is the auction house itself. So the auction house is completely driven by a currency called Lucent. Every single item that is bought and sold on the auction house is bought and sold with Lucent, and you can purchase Lucent with real money. So all these items can be directly purchased with real money, in other words. By any definition, that makes the game pay to win. The question is, if you're not going to pay to win, if you're a free-to-play player, how far behind are you? How much is this going to affect your ability to enjoy the game? What it really comes down to is there are several different ways you're progressing your character. You need traits, you need gear, you need to level up that gear, you need runes. You need several different things to get stronger, and some of those things you'll be able to buy off the market, and some of them will not. Just as a broad ballpark, I would say probably about a third of your character's power can be purchased with real life money. The rest of it, you have to actually play the game. You have to actually grind. You have to actually perform well in challenge dungeons. Whatever the mechanism is that you acquire that form of progression, you cannot just pay money and skip that. Except for that, like 1/3 of your character progression, which mainly comes down to traits. I would say that the traits on your gear is going to be the biggest pay to win thing that whales have access to. Now, when it comes to something like buying traits, the amount of traits that you have on your gear is limited. So it's not like whales can just keep buying more and more traits forever and always be stronger. They're going to cap out their gear, and that cap can be reached by a free to play player. So effectively, they can't just spend more money and always be ahead. They can be ahead at the beginning of a content release, but as a free to play player, you will catch up to them, and you'll be able to play a substantial portion of that content release and be the same level of power as a whale would be. So we've already talked about how content releases are going to be 3 to 4 months apart. You're really only going to feel the gap between free to play and whales in the first month of those. Really in the first like couple weeks you'll probably feel it the most. But eventually, even as a free to play player, even as a free to play and kind of casual player, if you are smart and you know what to do, you will be able to catch up and progress just fine, and you'll be able to hit those same caps that the whales are hitting. The one potential exception to this is with arc boss weapons. I don't know how to say it. And these are much less pay to win and more guild to win. So 99% of people who have an arc boss weapon got it from their guilds. There are going to be a handful of people who purchase these off the market, but honestly, they just don't appear on the market very often. And when they do, they're extremely expensive. So there aren't a ton of whales going around buying these high-end weapons and then dunking on everybody. Usually it is the most powerful guilds that have access to these weapons and hoard them. And then every once in a while, one of these weapons will show up on the market and a whale will buy it. But the odds that you're going to encounter that person out in the world or during an event or something are probably not going to be that high. On the Hyper Boost server, we all knew who the top whales were, and honestly, they weren't really relevant when it came to PvP. They didn't have the organization, they didn't have the player skill, like they didn't have all the other things that go into making you a competitive player or competitive guilds. This is not a game where you can just buy your way to the top. You still have to do all the other things. You still have to have the skill. You still have to have the guildies and everything else. So while the pay to win is certainly there, and I'm not interested in defending it, I will say as someone who did not spend a single dime on Korea, I did feel competitive. I did really well in Arena. I had a lot of fun playing with my guild. I mattered in Siege. I had a really strong KDA in Siege. And all that was without spending a single dime. So you can absolutely enjoy this game as a free-to-play player. Plenty of people, who have played in Korea, you can ask them that, and I think that they will agree. That will not keep you from being annoyed when you are upgrading your traits and in the back of your mind you could just pull out your credit card and just skip that whole process. It is very aggravating, and it does cheapen the progress that you make, knowing that that option is there. But it is what it is, and at the end of the day, I've said it already, but as a free-to-play player, I absolutely do think you can and will enjoy progressing in this game. So summarizing everything, my predictions for this game, I do not think that the launch will be as big as Lost Ark or New World, but I also do not think that this game will fall off post-launch nearly as hard as those games did. Most of the fall off for Throne and Liberty is going to happen very fast at the very beginning as people bounce off the terrible leveling and questing system. However, after that, I do think the game will stabilize and potentially even grow slowly over time as new updates are added. They have definitely won over me with the recent updates, and I think as kind of word gets out and people experience the new content, and as the quality of the game continues to increase, if they can keep up this pace that they've demonstrated in the last few months, if they can keep that momentum going, then I do think that the game will slowly grow over time as word gets out about how good it is. The game genuinely does get better the more you play it, and the updates have been rapidly increasing in both quality and quantity. The only explanation I have for what a 180 this game has done is there must have been some sort of change in leadership, because I mean it has been, so much has happened in such a short amount of time. It's really is just a completely different game. So I think they've got some different people at the wheel now, and I think that is going to continue. I think that is going to really continue improving the game. MMO devs are always, of course, capable of ruining a good thing, but this is one of the first, or not one of the first, but one of the few games that I have seen that genuinely seems like it is on the right track post-launch and getting better post-launch instead of worse. And so I do think the game has a chance to continue saving itself and become a stable long-term title for years to come. So I hope that continues to happen. I will definitely be playing hard on launch. I will be doing a subathon if that's something you're interested in doing or seeing. You can check me out over on Twitch. If the subathon, if you guys keep me on long enough, it's totally uncapped. So I'll eat on stream, I'll sleep on stream. We'll do the longest one I ever did was 110 hours for Elden Ring. So I don't know if we'll break that record for Throne, but I'm down for it if you guys want to check that out. I'll also continue to post video guides for this, kind of like I did for New World and BDOs. Those of you who know me from those games, you know that my guides are always absolutely the best guides that exist for whatever game it is at the time, hands down. So yeah, check those out if you're interested. I appreciate you guys watching the video, and I will see you around. And also join Discord, link in the description. All right, love you guys. Bye.